The Amiga was home to a multitude of classic titles, from Shadow of the Beast to Wings, and everything in between. There were tons of fantastic games for Amiga owners to cut their teeth on. Unfortunately, the tail end of its lifespan was drastically affected by the 16-bit console generation, as well as the heavy piracy scene around the Amiga itself. That's why Lionheart has been sadly underappreciated, both now and even on its initial release. Let's not beat around the bush. Lionheart is absolutely gorgeous. It was a late release for the Amiga that shows off a cavalcade of tricks that were possible on the aging hardware. The colours are bright and clean, with clever use of gradients and shifting colour palettes to make the game appear to show more than the Amiga was technically capable of. The game also makes heavy use of parallax scrolling, adding depth to each stage that far exceeded other games on the hardware. It seems appropriate that one of the early releases on the Amiga, Shadow of the Beast, used parallax to show off the power of the hardware. Lionheart was a late release that showed how far that particular feature had come in just a few short years. The sprite work in this game is also stunning. This is primarily down to this guy, Henk Nyborg. A quick glance at his portfolio reveals his work on some of the most impressive sprite-based games ever made, including Shantae 2, Contra 4, and The Adventures of Lomax. Lionheart was one of his earlier titles, but his talent shines through. Sprites are detailed, but clean. The world looks completely cohesive, but characters stand out against the environment just enough to ensure they never blend into the background. It was not just one of the best looking games on the Amiga, it was one of the best looking games, period. This wasn't just a case of flash over substance though. There is a meaty, satisfying action game lurking behind all this beauty. The platforming is supported by your character being able to attack in multiple directions. This is essential, since your enemies will be coming at you thick and fast. If you were expecting easy movement patterns and passive AI, think again. These monsters are extremely vicious and will attack very quickly. The terrain and situations vary as well. Some stages see you jumping from platform to platform through craggy rock formations, others will have you scaling hills and wide outdoor areas, and at one point, you'll even be flying through the sky on the back of a dragon. Lionheart does a good job at keeping you on your toes throughout the game by changing up the environment, both in terms of looks and in terms of gameplay. Controls end up being one of the few weak points for Lionheart. The multi-directional attacks are performed by holding the attack button and moving the joystick around. This can feel a bit clunky, especially when you're trying to stick and move in the middle of a pack of enemies. It's especially problematic on a single button controller, since the jump is mapped to the upwards motion. This means that if your coordination is a bit off, you'll find yourself jumping instead of attacking, and vice versa. The limited nature of the controls on the Amiga made complex action games on the hardware difficult, but it would still have been nice for Lionheart to feature a more robust setup. You eventually adjust to the awkward controls, so it doesn't ruin the game. It's a good thing too, since there's a lot to love here. One of the best things about the game is the replayability. Many platformers of the era would offer a couple of hours of playtime at best. Lionheart offers multiple difficulty levels that actually expand the gameplay in meaningful ways. Instead of just taking the boring route of tougher enemies and less health, Lionheart's higher difficulties actually open up additional parts of the levels, allowing for subsequent runs through the game to feel fresh and exciting. As I mentioned earlier, Lionheart fell victim to circumstance. Despite receiving some fantastic reviews from magazines at the time, the sales of the game simply weren't enough to keep the developers alive. Unfortunately, anyone who owned an Amiga probably remembers that the piracy scene for the computer was rampant. Cracked Amiga games were traded like marbles amongst players, and unfortunately, this led to unsustainably weak sales for what should probably have been a massive commercial hit. It's actually fairly difficult to play Lionheart these days. The game pushed the original Amiga hardware to its limits, so trying to play the game on the more common Amigas would lead to some fairly significant slowdown. To play the game on the original hardware, you really want an Amiga 1200, which is not exactly an easy call these days. However, if you do happen to be lucky enough to own the beefier hardware, and can pick up a copy of Lionheart, it should be an absolute no-brainer. To all of your console-owning friends who still disregard the Amiga as that weird computer thing, just pop this game in and see how they react. It's a showstopper for a reason.